Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here. My voice is a bit weak today, so bear with me. I'll do the best I can to get through this in one piece. Okay, well what we're going to look at, and maybe next time too, is a game in the Nimzo-Indian, and it's in the classical, well, maybe I shouldn't use the word classical. For me it's classic because when I was young, e3 was the most common move. So actually, Queen c2 on move 4 is sometimes referred to as the classical or sometimes the Capablanca variation. So broadly speaking, we can call this the Rubinstein complex, although really Rubinstein's variation is with the knight from g1 going to e2 before the bishop from f1 comes out. So be that as it may, this is, as I said, sometimes called the Rubinstein complex. So we'll take a look at, as I said, today's game, and I think probably next week too we may take a look at another one. It's a very rich system for both sides, really, and well, it's also a nice kind of change of pace from, let's say, Queen c2 lines or from the Queen's Indian defense, especially. Definitely an opening you can win with either side if you know what you're doing, and fairly, I don't want to easily, not in the sense of winning with a cheap trap or something like that. It's not that you're going to sucker your opponent into some kind of blunder on move 10 or something like to that effect, but it's once you understand the strategic ideas, the made plans for both sides in some of the key variations, you can have really a great deal of success with either side of this opening. Okay, well here Black has a plethora of choices. Well, okay, maybe four moves doesn't count as a plethora, but there are also some other minor moves as well. A move that seems to be recommended in all the repertoire books is b6, but I think this is just because it avoids, it cuts out a bit of theory, so I don't think there's anything that special about it. It's not a bad move. It's certainly very playable. It's it's the third choice in the databases, but again, I think it's at least a fair amount of the reason why it's promoted is just that it's a bit simpler, theoretically speaking. Castling right away is also a main move after e3, and that's in fact what was played in the game. There's also c5. This is quite a standard move as well. And I should say a little bit about d5 too, and why it's less played than the other moves. So there's nothing really wrong per se with d5, but here's the deal. Against the Samish, with 4a3, takes and takes, Black doesn't want to play d5 too quickly because it allows White to undouble his pawns. So Black will generally play something like c5 or b6, and there are some specific positions fairly well in where Black does play d5, but it's very concrete. I mean, if you play d5 straight away, then White makes this exchange. Let's say Black recaptures with the pawn, and then White has this well-known pawn roller setup, most famously seen in the old Botvinnik Capablanca game back in 1938. White plays bishop to d3. Well, the pawn goes to f3 sooner or later. The knight goes to e2. He castles, and White will try to get this central mass rolling with e4, then e5, and then f4, and so on, which is what happened in the Botvinnik Capablanca game. Very famous. If you don't know this game immediately by the reference, you should look it up straight away. Anyway, while it's certainly not a forced win for White, it is a very annoying plan for Black to deal with, and generally speaking, players with Black prefer to avoid this. Okay, so back to e3. If d5, White can play a3 now, and okay, Black can play bishop to e7. This is actually a legitimate move here. It looks like Black is losing a tempo on a Queen's Gambit decline, but he gains something too, which is that this bishop from c1 can no longer jump over the pawn. Well, it couldn't before either, but it can no longer go to g5 or to f4 because it can't jump the pawn. So it isn't clear how big of a detriment this really is for Black. Anyway, it's playable, and bishop takes c3 check is playable as well. As I said, it's just that you have to be prepared to deal with that pawn roller approach. Now, the plus of playing d5 here, especially against someone who's careless, is that Well, okay, if white plays bishop to d3, you haven't lost anything at all. So you can now play b6 or c5 or castle, whatever you want. And you cut out knight to e2 variations, which are quite unpleasant in some other systems, because here you can just take the pawn on c4. So after, for instance, b6, all right, white's main move here is in fact knight from g1 to e2. Likewise on 4 castles, knight to e2 is also playable here, although it's not considered as dangerous, but it is certainly a playable move. Also after c5, knight to e2 is actually, this move actually scores better than bishop to d3. So if you don't mind this same-ish line, if you don't mind going into that, or maybe you like the bishop to e7 line, then this at least gives you the option to cut out knight to e2 stuff altogether. So there are a lot of these little trade-offs. Okay, well in our game, black castled. And white played a3, takes and takes. So we have a same-ish after all. And typically here, as I suggested before, black plays c5 and goes for a kind of blockading approach. But the game we're going to look at today, I guess I should say who it's between. It's a Kaidanov game against Onishuk. So Kaidanov had white, Alexander Onishuk had black, and this was played in the Chicago Open back in 2002. And here Onishuk chose a rather rare line with d6. So he is going to go for a blockading setup, but instead of with c5, d6, b6, and so on. Actually, let me say a little bit more about this. So after c5, bishop to d3, knight c6, let's say knight e2, black plays b6, and on e4, knight to e8, avoiding what can be a very, very dangerous and annoying pin. Okay, so castles, bishop a6, f4, and f5. Okay, so black ideally wants to exert some serious pressure against this pawn on c4. That's the big plan there. While white is trying to create this monstrously big pawn center and ultimately attack over on the king side. So there's lots of theory on this, and certainly you should know it if you played the Nimzo with black, and you might want to consider knowing it with white too if you're if you allow the Nimzo-Indian. But we're not going to go down that route. I was just showing you what the main idea is, and it's perfectly good for black too. So d6 was played instead, and the idea is that after knight e2 he plays e5, and he's going to try to plug up the board in this way. This is what happened. So rather than leaving the center more or less alone, just blockading when necessary with f5 in that one variation, and certainly without trying to really go hardcore, at least straight away for the white c pawn, black is trying to plug it up. All right, well let's see. So bishop to b1, b6, and now white plays f3. So white again must open lines for the on the king side, wants to open up these diagonals for his bishops too. Black plays bishop to a6, f takes e4, bishop takes c4. White played queen f3 with the threat of e5 with a double attack, hitting the knight and the rook. So black completes his development with knight b to d7, or at least the development of his minor pieces. Okay, well now we have a very, very interesting position. Material is equal. Black's bishop on c4 is very nice, but white has his trumps too, to be sure. He's got the bishop pair. The bishop on c1 right now, granted, is not doing very much, but the bishop on b1 could become active, even if it costs a pawn with e5. White has this big center, has the open f file, but that bishop on c4 is really annoying because, okay, rook to f1, the bishop covers that. If white considers something like rook to a2 and then rook to f2, well, the bishop takes care of that one as well. So you might think, well, gee, let's just get rid of this bishop and play something like bishop to a2. But now black has a couple of good options. He could play b5, allow this exchange, and then play rook to b8. And yeah, white has that open f file, that's true, but because black has very good control over the e5 square, it's not easy for white to remove this knight from f6. It's backed up by the knight on d7. e5 won't really do the job. And meanwhile, black has some queenside ambitions. Rook to b3 is the most obvious move that comes to mind here. So black might even be a little bit better in this position. Okay, another idea for black that's also pretty good after bishop to a2 is maybe bishop to d3, putting some pressure against this guy. So this may not be so bad either. Of course, white could play bishop to b1 to protect it, but then black plays bishop c4, if nothing else. And white hasn't made any progress. So what else can white try? Well, there's an old Spassky game where he played a4. And this is a pretty sensible move. Just to put the bishop on a3, perhaps, and give that piece a little life. So in a game against a player Usi, I think was either a Finnish or Estonian master, the game went queen c8, king d2, queen a6, h4. And you can see, I mean, Spassky's doing what he can to get his rooks into the game, or at least the one rook into the game. But black defended very well for a while. Knight h7, then knight to g5, and rook e6. So you can play rook to f6 and also double on the e file. And finally, Spassky found nothing better than this exchange sacrifice. And he even went on to win, and fairly quickly after black played c5. But after the much more natural queen to a5, trying to either exchange, well, defends the g5 pawn, it offers a trade of queens, which makes sense since he's up the exchange. And if white rejects the exchange, then he has to drop his queen back. So this would have been clearly better for black. So a4, while logical in its own way, wasn't really much of a solution either. Okay, so what should white do here? Well, Kaidanov found really a spectacular answer to that problem. He came up with the move rook a2. And this is one of the main reasons to show this game. It's just a beautifully creative solution. If black doesn't take, the rook's going to slide over to f2, and obviously that's going to give him some good chances on the f file. If he does take, well, then the bishop on a2 is going to be an extremely strong piece, and white will castle, and the other rook will come to the f file. So either way, white is getting something that he really wants. Well, in the game, black played bishop takes a2, which is certainly the principled move. It's putting white's idea to the test. But it's at least a bit cooperative anyway. I don't know if it's a mistake. Objectively speaking, it probably isn't a mistake, but it, as I said, it gives white the easier play, to be sure. So there are a couple of other moves that can be considered here, at least. Ivan Sokolov, in his book Winning Chess Middle Games, mentioned c5, and I don't think he analyzed it any further, but this seems certainly reasonable. There's an earlier game, or sorry, a later game, but earlier than Sokolov's book, with rook to e6. And this was chosen in a game Moskalenko against Vieja Diacuna, played in Solsonis in 2004. Moskalenko was higher rated and went on to win, but had nothing for quite a while. So he played rook to f2, queen e8, h4, h5, very nice idea. Temporarily sacking the pawn, but now he gets this pawn on e4 and has no problems here at all. Okay, rook f4. Here, in fact, the best move might be g6. Rook g4 and just taking. Okay, if queen b1, black is clearly better, but maybe white still has some hopes with the opposite color bishops. If h5, then even though it looks really scary with all of these white heavy pieces around, black can defend. He just plays king to g7. The g6 pawn is attacked 3 times, it's defended 3 times, and white doesn't have anything left to throw at black. So you can try this, but now check, and bishop to g8, and the game should be over here. Okay, so that's with g6. Black played d5, which is not as good, but it's not bad either. And this position is simply equal. So Moskalenko, as I said, went on to win, but that was a function of just being a stronger player, and certainly not due to any objective merits of this particular position. Okay, another idea, which might even be best, is queen to e7. and on rook f2, just g6. And by maintaining the blockade over the e-file, that keeps the white bishops really well neutralized, and it's hard to see again how white is going to make any progress here. So, in the game, bishop takes a2 is played, and now we get to see white's idea in all of its glory. So, bishop takes a2, knight f8. Not the only move, but it makes some sense. The knight on g6. Well, it covers up some lines. The drawback of putting the knight on g6, though, is that it may walk into h4, h5. So, I'm not sure that knight f8 is actually the best defensive plan either. Okay, white castled, knight to g6. And, okay, here we again need to figure out what white's going to do. So white's made all the obvious natural moves, and now has to find something that basically legitimizes the sacrifice. So what would you do here? The most natural move, perhaps, is knight to f5. Certainly the most obvious move to look at first, but then you see, well, the pawn on e4 is loose. Rook takes e4, but here's an interesting idea. Knight to g3, switching back, with the point that if the rook retreats, let's say to e8, then we play e4, and the bishop's ready to come to g5, then maybe the knight goes to h5, and all of a sudden, every single white piece is functioning perfectly. So the bishops are both going to be on great diagonals. The heavy pieces have a nice open file. White's pawn center is very stable, and the knight's ready to go to h5 or maybe f5 in some cases. However, black has a very good move here. d5. Black should maintain the blockade. So this is very much a kind of a Nimzo-Indian 101. You want to blockade white's big center. I mean, white generally has more central pawns, or often has more central pawns in a lot of these Nimzo lines, and it's key for black to keep them blockaded. And e4 is one of the main blockading squares that black really focuses on in this opening. So here after d5, knight e4, d e4, black is still a pawn ahead, so he gave back the exchange, but still has an extra pawn. The pressure against f7 is not going anywhere for any time soon, and the white bishop on c1 is still pretty poor. Certainly, black has or white has some compensation with the two bishops. I mean, there are ideas like c4, bishop to b2, and bishop to b2, d5 at some point perhaps, and trying to use the space and the bishops, but black is pretty solid. Certainly, it's up to white to prove real compensation here. And also d5, you've got to be careful that you don't allow knight to e5. Okay, so knight to f5 is interesting, but probably doesn't create any clear play. Knight h5 is certainly possible, but black just plays the calm rook to f8, and should again be okay. I mean, white can regain a pawn by taking 3 times on f6, but black should be all right there too. So it's a possibility. It's not bad, but certainly it's not the end of the world for black either by any stretch. The move chosen by Kaidanov was just a very patient bishop to d2. So this is a long-term sacrifice he's made. It's not part of a combination. There's no quick forced win. Rather, he's simply excuse me. He's going to take advantage of the bishops, of the extra space, of the f-file, and the fact that black really has no obvious way to gain active play. Okay, well, that's what white is up to here. What should black now do? Very natural move, I think, and not a bad one, is perhaps rook to f8. But after this, then white plays knight f5. There's no longer any pressure against the e4 pawn, so this is certainly pleasant for white. Well, the move that Onishuk chose was queen of d7, but this has a drawback too, kind of a subtle one. See if you can figure out what might be wrong with this move. Well, I should rephrase that. It's not that there's anything wrong with this move, but it makes something possible that wasn't available earlier. Well, here's the move the white played, knight to f5. And the key difference is that now taking on e4 isn't quite as attractive. Well, there's actually quite a bit to see, but let's start with knight takes e4. What should white do about this? The problem with knight takes e4 is bishop takes f7 check. This is a crusher. If queen f7, knight to h6 check wins the queen. And if king takes f7, it's even worse. Knight h6 check, king e7, queen takes e4 check, and the problem is this rook on a8. Black can't keep it defended, well, without losing lots and lots more. If he plays knight to e5, then there's rook to f7 check. That's no good. If queen e6, well, rook f7 check, and now there's nothing but king to d8, and then queen takes a8, and white ends up a piece or more ahead. So knight takes e4 is no good. Well, how about rook takes e4? Try to assess this one. This is very, very interesting. Well, the right move here, and the natural move, excuse me again, is knight takes g7. And this is the move, this was the idea that I was referring to when I asked, what did queen to d7 allow? Before, when the queen was on d8, king takes g7 would be a perfectly adequate answer to this move. Here, though, it's not so adequate at all. White takes on f6, takes on f7, and black's position collapses. Black has an amazing resource here, though. Very, very easy to overlook this. Knight f4. Okay, what in the world's going on here? Well, this is all about plugging up the f-file, so it's another kind of blockading move. Black is trying to, in whatever way possible, whatever way is necessary, shut that f-file so the white pieces can't just crash through there. Okay, well, white has reasonable play here, but I'm not sure that he has an advantage in any variation. So let's take a look at some possibilities here. Okay, one very interesting move is knight to e6. So if knight f4 wasn't a confusing enough move to look at, this should really get your head spinning here. Well, the knight was trapped, so it's just the best way to try to bring it out. Okay, f takes e6, e takes f4, and now d5. So the f-file is now closed, the a2 g8 diagonal is closed, and black is in possession of the e4 square. Now, white can regain the exchange that he sacrificed, but take a look at, or compare the minor pieces that will be left on the board after bishop takes e4, knight e4. Black's knight is very good. It controls lots of light squares and has access to lots more, while the white bishop on d2 is not very good at all. So after rook to f8, queen g7 is possible too. It's another reasonable move. But let's say rook f8. Here, what white should do is not take, but play bishop to e1, and then swing this guy around to h4. And I think white can just survive with an equal position in a variation like this. So after all of those adventures, material is even, and I would say the position is about even too. So this should be a draw. Okay, so that's a very complicated line. Another possibility, instead of knight to e6, is the more direct bishop to b1. Again, black should fight for the e4 square, d5. Okay, if e takes f4, king g7, this is about equal. Again, bishop e1, h4 might be an idea for white at this point. Or we can take and then play queen f4. And now black should be careful. Which piece should he take in this position? Taking on d2 is bad. Knight h5 wins. So the king is very exposed, and the threat of knight to f6 check is also extremely unpleasant. So this is no good. King takes g7 is right. Of course, we want to leave ourselves with this great knight against this mediocre bishop. White should play bishop to e1, and black is probably, it's either equal or maybe even a touch better for black. I mean, his king's position could be a little bit better. If he had a g-pawn and give white another pawn somewhere, then black would definitely stand better. But even as it is, he's at worst on the sunny side of equality. Maybe a good way to proceed now is with rook e8, e6. All right, So that's after knight f4, bishop to b1. Finally, it's just taking the knight straight away. King takes g7, and now f5, with two possible ideas that are on the agenda here. One would be bishop to d5, taking advantage of the rooks, since knight takes d5, queen e4 is there. And another idea is to play bishop to g5, activating that piece, and again trying to imperil the black rooks. Okay, so those are some possibilities that can occur after rook takes e4, which might have been the best move. All right, but Onishuk simply went back to d8, which I guess you could see as maybe an implicit draw for white could play knight to g3, black could bring the queen back to d7, and so on. All right, so what does white do now, though? Again, all of his pieces seem to be about as well placed as they can be, and now because the queen is covering the f6 square, rook takes e4 is now definitely a threat. All right, so what does white do? Well, Kaidanov found a fantastic solution. He played e5, and on d takes e5, e4. So this breaks the blockade. Now black is not going to have control over e4 anymore, and this bishop on d2, or from d2, is going to come into the game in a mighty way. So he's threatening bishop to g5, and not only bishop to g5. So black played e takes d4, and now what should white do? Bishop to g5, or something else? Well, bishop to g5 is not a bad move, but black can probably just squeak out with equality here. So here's a sample variation. Knight e5, and now d takes c3. So allowing white to crash in with knight takes g7, but black is up an awful lot of material. I mean, even after this pawn capture, black is up the exchange in 2 pawns, and so he can afford to be a little bit generous here. So check, queen e4, grabbing another pawn. Even here, black is up 3 pawns, so when he gives back this knight, it's really not so bad. All right, knight to g4 with a double attack, and white really has to play rook f7. And after queen e3, knight e3, white has a draw. Only like this. So white just barely survives after bishop to g5. So white really needs something better than that, at least if he wants to have any advantage. The right move is knight takes g7. And this is a crusher, really. If black takes, then bishop to g5 is winning. Black has no good way to defend the knight, since if rook e6, the bishop on a2 would just take it. And trying to give up the queen in exchange for enough little guys really doesn't quite pan out either. In this position, white has a queen and a bishop for a rook and 2 knights, and the black king is still pretty exposed. The pawns on c7 and then subsequently a7 and b6 are a bit vulnerable too. So this should be winning for white. Certainly much, much better. So Onishuk tried knight to e5. Kaidanov played queen h3, just getting out of the way of any of these any possible knight attacks here. And now Onishuk played d takes c3. If he plays knight takes e4, kind of a feisty approach here, then knight e8 and bishop to h6. Okay, so we can see that the black king side is obviously extremely vulnerable. White's down 2 pawns, but c takes d4 is a very big threat. Queen f5 is probably not such a bad threat either. And let's say black plays knight takes c3. So threatening the bishop on a2, going a 3rd pawn up, but now queen h4 wins. So the threat is to play queen f6 and then give mate on g7. And if queen c6, then there's this clever little triangulation move here, queen to g3. If black retreats or blocks with the queen, then queen takes e5. And okay, now the f7 pawn is threatened, so if queen h6, bishop f7 check is just winning outright. So knight a2, rook f6. Black gets a couple of checks, but they don't go anywhere. And after this, black has to give up the queen. Yeah, you can't take on f6 because of knight e4 check, but white will get to g7 sooner or later. And now it's mate in no more than 2 moves. Okay, so that's what happens on queen to g6. If knight to g6, well, then that's easy. Just rook takes f7 is going to decide. Yeah. All right. So that's a crusher here as well. Okay. So knight takes e4 here is not going to work. Ownership try d takes c3. And this makes sense too. If bishop to g5, there's queen to d4 check. But white can just play calmly. Bishop takes c3. So he's down the exchange and a pawn, and black can even take the knight. In fact, does. But still, white just has too much attack. Queen g3 check. Now, if the king moves, bishop takes e5, and then the knight on f6 is going to be in huge trouble as well. So Ownershuk played knight to g6. And now, a last critical moment for white. And this one, actually, Kaidanov botched a little bit. So he still went on to win the game, but he made his life much, much more difficult than it needed to be. So white to move here, what should you do? Of course, we're going to take the knight on f6 sooner or later, but it's not running away just yet. So the best move would have been h4, introducing some new threats in the position. So just to give an example, if black plays queen to d6, now we'll make this exchange. And now a very nice move here for white, e5 check. Very, very tactically clever move. All right, if knight takes e5, we have mate in 1, like that. If rook takes e5, the loose rook on a8 falls. This is check, and then we grab it. If the king goes to g7, of course we play h5, and we win the knight. And finally, if king to e7, well, this one's a little bit more positionally oriented. There's no quick way to capitalize as in the other variations, but still, white is winning after h5, let's say knight h8, queen g5 check. So black's king is rather exposed. A lot of his pawns are quite weak, and the knight on h8 is obviously not brilliant. But if he goes to f8 instead, whoops, if the knight goes to f8, then, well, again, queen g5 check, and then we can take this guy, and white's making more progress that way. The e-pawn's going to become dangerous. So this is no improvement. Well, in the game, Kaidanov played bishop takes f6, and this made his life a lot tougher. So here, black can put up a lot of resistance, and he did, although Kaidanov eventually broke him down. Okay, so this was more or less forced, but it turns out to not be so easy to break through here. You can see that black's queenside pawns are pretty safe, and white has no passers. There's no immediately obvious way for the queen and bishop to generate any attacking prospects either. But he finds a way. So he plays queen to c6, and what white eventually wants to do is to go after the g6 square. So the idea is to play bishop to b1 and then e5. So that way on f takes e5, he can play queen g6, or maybe bishop g6, but queen makes more sense. And if rook takes e5, then queen c7. So black just expedited things. He just took right away, queen c7, and then blocked. Maybe this way of blocking is better. The reason is that, well, you'll see in the game that white is able to kind of go behind the black king and still work her way around to the g6 pawn. So white can still probably get to bother g6 sooner or later, but this might be a little bit more resilient. So here, queen to b8 happened, and now black had to make some concession or other. He doesn't want to play rook to e8 because then he drops the a7 pawn, and in fact the b6 pawn too, in the process. But king h6 probably still wasn't best. Maybe f5 is a better try. But now that he's kicked the king out, he can get to the g6 pawn, and he'll have a winning position. Well, he has a winning position here. And the game didn't go much longer. Rook c7, queen g7, a few checks, and now the checks are about to be over. You can get one more in with rook c3 and then king to d2, and that's it. So Onyshuk resigned at this point. So a very, very creative game by Kaidanov. I mean, some really beautiful chess. Rook a2 was a fantastic idea, and then a few moves later, this whole breakthrough combination with e5, e4, and then knight takes g7 was, again, just really fantastic. I mean, Kaidanov, certainly a great player still, but I mean, in his prime, was just a fantastic attacker. I mean, a really, really outstanding player in that aspect of the game. And I think this is a beautiful example. But this game is also, I think, very useful for demonstrating some key Nimzo-Indian themes. This battle that White has, in particular, with this center versus the black blockade. So that's one of the really the fundamental or quintessential battles in the 4e3 Nimzo-Indian. Can black manage to blockade the white center and the white bishops, or will they break out and come into their own? And in this game, as we saw, white was successful, but black had various ways to keep the balance, or maybe even be a little bit better, for example, by not capturing the exchange when white offered it, and then here with that fantastic idea, rook takes e4, knight g7, and then knight to f4. So it's, if you haven't played the Nimzo-Indian, I hope you'll try it out. I mean, it's another very, very rich complex, definitely worth exploring. You know, a lot of really fantastic ideas for both sides, and again, so rich that you can just, it's not an opening that will get you bored. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this, and also I hope you gave yourself a little bit of a tactical workout as well, trying to puzzle through some of these attacking variations. So, thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.